those towers collapsed at free fall speed. Not quite 15 seconds. The law of conservation of momentum would have predicted about 45 seconds had there in fact been resistance to the collapse at each floor. But there was no resistance. Because the only explanation for the first 3 steel frame buildings in the history of mankind to collapse as a result of fire, all on the same day, all in the same place, all at free fall speed, all diving symmetrically into their own footprint, ladies and gentlemen, has nothing to do with fire, but was in fact a controlled demolition, 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 demolition.
I got an eyewitness who said there was an explosion on floor 7 and 8. That's tower 2.
Firefighter Richard Benefisky, speaking of the South Tower, said there was just an explosion. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings. It seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions. Deputy Commissioner Thomas Fitzpatrick said it looked like sparkling around one specific layer of the building. My initial reaction was that this was exactly the way it looks when they show you these implosions on TV. A few witnesses spoke of horizontal ejections. Chief Frank Crothers said there was what appeared to be an explosion. It appeared at the very top, simultaneously from all 4 sides. Material shot out horizontally, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. This testimony is very important because the official theory says that the horizontal ejections were produced when the floors collapsed and pushed the materials out. So listen to firefighter James Curran, who said, I looked back and I heard like every floor went choo choo choo. I looked back and from the pressure everything was getting blown out of the floors before it actually collapsed. If all these firefighters and medical workers witnessed all these phenomena suggestive of controlled demolition, it might be wondered why they have not spoken out. Part of the answer is probably provided by Auxiliary Lieutenant Fireman Paul Isaac, having said that there were definitely bombs in those buildings. Isaac added that many other firemen know there were bombs in the buildings, but they're afraid for their jobs to admit it because the higher-ups forbid discussion of this fact. Isaac, for example, has more recently said, I know 9/11 was an inside job. The police know it's an inside job, and the firemen know it too. But you have not heard this on the nightly news. On the nightly news. On the nightly news.
At a hotel in Arlington, Virginia. It shows the explosion that followed the crash of American Airlines Flight 77 into the Pentagon, but the video does not show the airplane. The video's existence was disclosed in 2002. The hotel manager says it was confiscated by the FBI. It was just publicly released as the result of a lawsuit.
And here is that agenda, the military mission statement of a right-wing think tank, the Project for the New American Century. Written a year before 9/11, it's supported by key members of the current Bush administration.
The drafting was supervised by Cheney, by Donald Rumsfeld, by Paul Wolfowitz, by Jeb Bush, who's the president's younger brother, and by Lewis Libby, who's Cheney's chief of staff. This is about control over Middle East oil. It indicates that America is aiming for global leadership, both military and economically, and what it says, I think, is chilling. It says if we are going to transform America into tomorrow's dominant force, that's their phrase, then it's going to be a long process unless there is a catastrophic and catalyzing event, like Pearl Harbor.
So, what happened? Well, September 11th happened, obviously, and George W. Bush had to rethink. But for many of those around Bush, there was no rethink. There didn't have to be. Long before September 11th, a small, influential group of neoconservatives here in Washington had wanted to see the United States transformed into a sort of benevolent ruler, unchallenged, astride the world. And long before George W. Bush was elected, they sat down and they wrote down a manifesto. The document was effectively a charter of the Project for a New American Century, a neoconservative think tank in Washington.
The founding members included Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz of the Defense Department, Richard Pearl, head of the Defense Advisory Board, Lewis Libby, Cheney's chief of staff, John Bolton, Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, Cohen, who's on the Defense Policy Board.
Much of what these men wanted is coming true. They urged that the U.S. abandon the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. It has. They wanted establishment of more permanent U.S. military bases abroad. That is happening in the Philippines and in Georgia and will likely happen in Iraq. They urged regime change as a goal of foreign wars, not just in Iraq. They wanted the U.S. as a global constabulary, their word, unburdened by the UN or world opinion, preventing any challenge to U.S. dominance. But, they wrote, a year before September 11th, such aspirations are unlikely to be realized without a catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor.
The United States of America is the most powerful nation on earth. In itself, this goes a long way to explaining the things it does around the world. At present, it's conducting a war on terror, or more accurately, a campaign against opposition to US domination. Others prefer to call it the beginnings of the Third World War. The United States has an insatiable appetite for conflict, and since going into Korea in the 1950s, it's been at war with someone or other in some corner of the globe non-stop right up to the present day. This drive is now led by the weapons manufacturers themselves. It is a highly dangerous precedent. I call it war corporatism. is the door of a new fascism being pushed open. And don't be fooled, not all fascism looks like Adolf Hitler. The reality, as we see from the Iraqi invasion, is that the presidency has been captured by the most powerful elements of this corporatism. And this ghastly molecule aims to turn the world into its very own enslaved global market, and the plan is well underway. The attack by Al-Qaeda on the World Trade Center is just one response to it. Is this a conspiracy? Quite the opposite. It is a high-profile project known as the Project for the New American Century. People like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl are the major players among politicians, right-wing thinkers, militarists and industrialists in the creation of the project. The project is a neoconservative manifesto which includes in its toolbox the unbridled use of war in clearing a path for US interests. The will to attack Iraq came entirely from this visible yet sinister group. September the 11th was merely the pretext. Bush is merely the figurehead. And so, who's next, you wonder? Iran? North Korea? France? Britain? None of us really matter to them.
The North American Aerospace Defense Command is charged with defending North America's airspace. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, Vice President Dick Cheney was in control of NORAD. This was the first time in U.S. history that a president or vice president was in direct control of the military agency. NORAD was founded in 1957, and generals always had the power to shoot down or intercept hijacked aircraft. But on June 1st, 2001, just 3 months before 9/11, Dick Cheney ordered Donald Rumsfeld to allow him to take control of NORAD itself and the shoot-down procedure, and remove that power from the generals so they could do nothing. Here is a copy of the memorandum from Rumsfeld to the Joint Chiefs, telling them they no longer have any authority. An Associated Press article in August of 2002 reported that the CIA just so happened to be running a drill on the morning of 9/11 of flying jets in the World Trade Center and Pentagon. Then senior FAA officials ordered air traffic controllers to shred the tapes from 9/11 in violation of federal law. AP learned of the drills because at a Homeland Security function after 9/11, they bragged about it. Oh, we had foresight. We were running drills that very morning. Then USA Today reported that drills held weeks before 9/11 included targets that were the Pentagon and World Trade Center. Biggest holes in their argument is the fact that they never heard of a plan to fly hijacked jets into landmarks on the East Coast.
We're going to take a closer look tonight at another example of where, despite the conventional wisdom, there were people in the United States who actually were preparing to defend against the kind of attacks which occurred here on 9/11. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD for short, has been defending the skies over the U.S. and Canada for almost 50 years, 46 to be precise. USA Today reports that in the 2 years before the attacks on September the 11th, NORAD conducted exercises using hijacked airliners as weapons. And one target was the World Trade Center.
We knew he hated us. But there was nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government, that could envision flying airplanes into buildings on such a massive scale.
But that turns out not to be true. U.S. military planners did envision and practice those very scenarios. As reported by USA Today, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, conducted exercises with fighter jets, simulating hijacked planes flown into the World Trade Center in the 2 years before the attack.
And so then I saw Condoleezza Rice get up on TV and say, we had never thought, we had never heard. Why, that's a ridiculous conspiracy theory to say that.
Pentagon planners also envisioned the attack on the Pentagon 5 months before it happened.
The Pentagon had a drill in November of 2000 simulating a hijacked jet being flown to the Pentagon. So between all the drills before 9/11 and the drill in the morning of 9/11, air traffic controllers thought that it was a simulation.
Hijacked aircraft headed towards New York. Is this real world or exercise? No, this is not an exercise, not a test.
September 11th, 2001. NORAD is in the middle of a number of military exercises. The first, Vigilant Guardian, is described as an exercise that would pose an imaginary crisis to North American air defense outposts nationwide. The second, Northern Vigilance, moved fighter jets to Canada and Alaska to fight off an imaginary Russian fleet. 3 F-16s from Washington, D.C.'s National Guard at Andrews Air Force Base, 15 miles from the Pentagon, are flown 180 nautical miles away for a training mission in North Carolina. This left 14 fighter jets to protect the entire United States.
I wanted to focus just a moment on the Presidential Emergency Operating Center. You were there for a good part of the day. I think you were there with the Vice President. And we had that order given, I think it was by the President, that authorized the shooting down of commercial aircraft that were suspected to be controlled by terrorists. Were you there when that order was given?
No, I was not. I was made aware of it during the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon. There was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? Well, at the time I didn't know what all that meant. And
the flight you're referring to is the
flight that came into the Pentagon.
The fact that they were holding war games on the day that mimicked the actual attack scenario in every aspect, and then that afterwards they claimed we couldn't have imagined that such a thing would happen, although it was exactly the scenario that we were rehearsing. Hijackings, crashes into buildings, an emergency in New York City, all this was being rehearsed on the day as part of a plan. So when they say we couldn't have imagined it, they're lying.
We've now found out that there were 15 exercises going on that day involving all the fighter jets in the northeastern portion of the United States. What are the odds of that occurring?
Supposed to believe is some kind of coincidence. There was also an anti-terrorist drill going on 7/7. And again, just like 9/11, they were talking about attacks on the same targets, the same kind of tube stations, and exactly the same time as the actual attack happened.
How many of you know that NORAD stood down for over an hour and 25 minutes, but if your Cessna gets off course for 5 minutes, they're going to launch F-16s on you? Remember Payne Stewart, the golfer? 15 minutes after his jet got off track, they had F-16s all around him. But on 9/11, in the most controlled airspace in the world, they could do nothing about 4 jets. But it gets worse. Guess why NORAD stood down? The average people in the military are good folks. They were told it was a drill because the Associated Press reported, and the CIA's own website admits, that on the morning of 9/11, the CIA was running a drill of flying hijacked jets into the World Trade Center and Pentagon. It was just a coincidence. At 8:30 in the morning, there was a drill of the exact same thing happening, and so NORAD stood down.
My thesis is Able Danger are the terrorist controllers. Mohammed Atta, he can't get through the day. He's got to have money. He's got to have help. Terrorist controllers, case officers, babysitters for Atta. The main consumer of Able Danger intelligence is Major General Jeffrey Lambert, Special Forces. And he tells them, he says, look, they have a chart with all these Al-Qaeda characters, including Atta, before the fact. And he gets these yellow Post-it notes, and he puts one on Atta's face, saying, that reminds you, you can't share information about him. So they knew exactly who these people were, of course, because they were telling them what to do. Every year there's a drill called Able Warrior, and the theme is only one thing, anti-terrorism. Now if you look at the way that they do this, they have drills in binary pairs. One side pretends to be the defenders, and the other side pretends to be the attackers, okay? So if Able Warrior are the defenders, anti-terrorism, what's Able Danger? Able Danger is a troop of attackers to be used to simulate attacks during anti-terror drills. In other words, those double agents are there as actors, if you like, in normal drills, but then at a certain point, wham, the drill goes live and something happens.
I know you said there'll be a time for politics, but you've also said you wanted to change the tone of Washington. Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, you know, it's time for politics. And it's an absurd insinuation.
In that case, sir, can I follow up on something unrelated?
Larry Silverstein, new leaseholder of the World Trade Center, regretfully declared that a decision was made to pull Building 7 by the end of the day, the last structure added to the World Trade Center complex. Let's hear Mr. Silverstein's actual words, delivered for our benefit in the 2002 PBS documentary, America Rebuilds.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Blast, shoot, blow, and pull are terms used in the demolition industry to refer to bringing down buildings, bridges, and other structures.
Because I actually blew the hospital down that I was born in.
Originally, we had figured to shoot it, let it drop straight down.
Then, watch Demolition Dynamics attempt a big blast.
And from Ground Zero's own post-disaster wrecking crew.
By mid-December, the Department of Design and Construction had leveled World Trade Center buildings 4 and 5.
Hello? Oh, we're getting ready to pull building 6.
Silverstein, a commercial real estate tycoon with international political connections, acquired a 99-year lease on the World Trade Center complex in the spring of 2001. Throughout the summer, he reworked the insurance policies on his new property, making sure that it was covered for acts of terrorism. Explicit in the lease agreement was Silverstein's right to rebuild the complex if it were destroyed. After 9/11, Mr. Silverstein fought his insurers in court to obtain double his policy limits for the destruction of his property, maintaining that the double hijacking constituted 2 disasters caused by terrorists, not just one. He won and was awarded over $7 billion, a magnificent return on his original $15 million investment.
Just in the last few seconds, another building, building number 7, one of the buildings in support of the World Trade Center towers, has collapsed.
World Trade 7, functioning as the command center for the complex, housed giant diesel backup and oxygen systems, the mayor's protected emergency bunker, and offices for the CIA, Secret Service, Department of Defense, and Securities and Exchange Commission. Its other tenants were insurance companies, brokerages, and banks. No plane hit Building 7, but at 5:20 p.m. on September 11th, it collapsed in a heap on the ground. Some damage to Building 7 is said to have been caused by debris from Tower 1. Though this New York Times article tells us Building 7 burned like a giant torch, the only visuals that exist are of unidentified smoke and a few small fires. Compare this to the wallops sustained by World Trade Center 3, 4, 5, and 6. Positioned right below the towers, damage to the surrounding World Trade Center buildings was infinitely worse. Still, the structures held up. But somehow, rescue workers knew that Building 7 would fall.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down soon.
A 47-story skyscraper, Building 7 folded neatly in 6.5 seconds. A textbook descent right into its footprint. Silverstein Properties now tells us that its owner was referring to the team of firefighters inside the building when he spoke of the decision to pulling the firemen out of harm's way. However, there were no firefighters in Building 7, according to FEMA, NIST, and Fire Chief Frank Fellini. They were ordered out at 11:30 that morning. 6 hours later, the building came down.
You know, we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. About a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that.
Radio host Alex Jones notes the mark of a classic implosion.
This is a photo taken 1 second into Building 7's collapse. Notice the crimp. If we look at other controlled demolitions, we see that they first blow one of the central columns so the building falls in on itself. If you don't do this, the building falls outward and can damage surrounding structures. Building 7 had a classic crimp or wedge. Its central column was blown out first, so it didn't structurally damage buildings just a few feet away from it.
Remember the mayor's emergency bunker? Ensconced on the 23rd floor of Building 7, it was retrofitted with superglass, water, oxygen, and its own generator. But Mayor Giuliani chose to find emergency shelter elsewhere on September 11th. Why Building 7? Even the media and its experts were confused. The History Channel interviews structural engineer Ramon Gil-Sans, who points out the obvious crimp and even speaks of the implosion.
Engineers are not just focusing on the Twin Towers. The most disturbing structural event was not that the Twin Towers fell, but that Tower 7, ignited by flying debris, fell due to fire alone.
Building 7 was a steel frame building, and is the first steel frame building that has collapsed due to fire. The failure of the building was an implosion. So it failed completely different than Towers 1 and 2, in which the floors failed first.
Why Building 7? Let's ask the question again. As the WTC Command Center, was it the hub for the 9/11 plan? Also, in 6.5 seconds, lost forever were thousands of SEC case files on corporate fraud, including those relating to the notorious activities of giants WorldCom and Enron. A few indictments for stock fraud, but what of the $70 billion California electricity swindle? It disappeared.
It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Wat je ziet bij Het World Trade Center. Dit zijn beelden van gebouw nummer 7.
Ja.
Ja.
Ze hebben gewoon kolommen weggeblazen. Er is nagesprongen. Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten?
Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Maar dit is ook op 11 september gebeurd.
Dezelfde dag?
Dezelfde dag.
Dezelfde dag? Weet je dat zeker?
Ja.
Was het zeker weten de 11e? Totaal heel waar zijn.
7 uur nadat de World Trade Center naar beneden viel.
Ja? Hebben ze hard gewerkt.
How and when does steel melt? Steel melts at temperatures of 2750 degrees Fahrenheit and above, attained only in a blast furnace or when a powerful incendiary such as thermite is used. Steel or any substance that is burned will never become hotter than the temperature of the fire or heat applied to it. An open-air hydrocarbon fire reaches a maximal temperature of some 1200 degrees Fahrenheit in a dirty or uncontrolled burn, characterized by red-orange flames. Red-orange flames are what we saw on September 11th. Even the fireball caused by the plane strike was red-orange. A controlled burn falls between a dirty burn like a fireplace and a controlled environment, the blast furnace. A controlled burn employs a regulated mix of air and fuel, an example being your gas stove or the engine in your car. You can fire up your gas stove all day long, making soup, roasting a duck, or simmering a stew. Made of steel, your stove will not melt, and nor will your pots and pans. This is a kerosene heater designed for use in any ordinary house. The heater runs on jet-grade kerosene contained in this tank. Made of steel, the heater can operate all night and all day. The kerosene fumes ignite and burn inside it, never causing even the smallest part of this heater to weaken or melt. Yet we were led to believe that these tremendous buildings, framed in steel and surfaced in aluminum, totally collapsed from small scattered fires and 90 minutes of smoke. Take note of these hurtling beams, thrown laterally outward as the tower comes to earth. Would fire have the strength to eject such huge hunks of metal? Thermite. An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. This is thermite melting the engine of a car. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. The second product of a thermite reaction is aluminum oxide, visible as white smoke. Was thermite used in conjunction with explosives on September 11th? Watch this very bright substance pouring from the 81st floor of the South Tower. And white smoke appeared at the base of the building. Would this be aluminum oxide, the byproduct of a thermite reaction? Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results. Let's look at what happens in the demolition industry. Taking down large structures requires preparation. Powerful explosives and heavy equipment are used in advance to weaken the foundation and bottom sections of a building before additional explosives and gravity bring the rest of it down. The words of a senior blaster.
We blow the basement, all the columns in the basement. Then we crack it up at the top to get it started. We go every other floor all the way down. Every explosive has a timer on it. That's why it's controlled. When the columns go, each floor goes down and impacts the one below and keeps going.
Here's what demolition experts use in steel-framed buildings: the linear shaped charge.
It's a chevron-shaped or V-shaped charge that you can focus at a specific target, and it's lethal. It generates around 3 million pounds per square inch pressure at a speed, depending on the explosive inside the shaped charge, in excess of 27,000 feet per second.
Besides the unfathomably powerful shaped charge, blasters have a lot of tricks.
There are over 1,000 different types of explosive. Different because they detonate at varying speeds.
With the use of delays, we can control pretty much where the debris lands. We can control vibration. We can control noise levels. Timing and delays are the key to just about everything in our business.
And what is the result?
The thing that pleases me is the fragmentation and the control. When to take a building and break it up into millions of pieces and put it in this basement as artfully as we do it, and it works just like clockwork. So we've got it all down to a science. It gives me goosebumps to talk about it.
These core columns were discovered after the collapse. The angled cut occurs in exactly the manner that shaped charges slice through steel beams to control the way they fall. Notice the hardened once liquid metal. Was thermite used with the shaped charge?
The job of the shaped charge is to cut steel H-beams.
The way we do this is by cutting the beam at an angle, which, through a series of beams cut at the same angle, will tend to make the building shift over and walk.
Let's look at the rubble of two 110-story buildings brought to the ground. In a 7-story crater lie nearly 2 million tons of debris. Had the basements not been blown out, where would 2 million tons have gone? Heaped on the ground, ready to slide and spill? The art of controlled demolition. The steel in dragon-like lengths and contortions spoke for itself. Bent, deformed, without cracks.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
Typically you'd have buckling and tearing on the tension side, but there's no buckling at all. There's no buckling at all.
Here is the meteorite, molten iron fused with concrete.
And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
It is true that heat expands steel. In a fire, steel members may swell and bend slightly. But this, how could these huge tangles have been created? The steel below the towers had melted at many thousands of degrees. Since metal conducts heat, Were these twisted remains formed by high temperatures wicking their way through a gridwork of steel? Explosives also deform steel. As they fire, gas pushes outward. The force of the gas can easily bend a large steel column. Two kinds of debris, huge shattered columns that could break a truck, combined with matter that was near pulverized.
You have two 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big.
Who was a director in the company that provided electronic security for the World Trade Center and Washington's Dulles Airport, both involved in September 11th? None other than the president's younger brother. From 1996 to 2000, Securacom installed what was referred to as a new security system at the World Trade Center. Wirt D. Walker III, a cousin of the Bush brothers, was CEO of Securacom from 1999 until 2002. Interestingly, these facts have not been made public. Was it only a security system that was added during those years, or was it also the wiring for a long-awaited plan? Scott Forbes, an IT specialist in a firm that had leased space in the South Tower since its erection, reported an unprecedented power down in his building for almost the whole weekend prior to 9/11.
We were notified 3 weeks in advance of the power down by the Port Authority. That was relatively short notice to plan to shut down all of our banking systems. It was a big deal. It was unprecedented. We had a data center on the 97th floor, so our originating servers were all there. During that weekend, the power down meant that there was no security. The doors were all open, basically. And also the security video cameras were all off. But there were guys in overalls carrying huge toolboxes and reels of cables walking around the building on that weekend.
Employees were notified that internet cables were being upgraded. But who were the strange workmen, and what were they really doing?
All the power was shut down. If there was a power down, that meant that everything was gone in terms of security, in terms of access to the building, so anybody could have gone there and do any kind of setup.
Having worked overtime to get his company's servers back up, Scott took the day off on September 11th. As he watched the towers collapse from New Jersey that morning, he was sure this had been the purpose of the mysterious weekend work. Scott notified many authorities, including the 9/11 Commission, about the unusual and lengthy power outage, but was ignored. Ben Fountain of Fireman's Fund spoke of unusual evacuations ordered at the Twin Towers during the weeks before September 11th. Others reported that the security alert was inexplicably lifted 5 days prior and bomb-sniffing dogs were removed. What would the dogs have discovered had they remained on duty? Although they were idolized as cathedral-like symbols of power and triumph that pierced the New York skyline, the Twin Towers were big money losers for the Port Authority of New York. They cost millions a year to equip with the basics: electricity, water, heat, air conditioning, sewage, and even oxygen, being airtight. As modern communications connected traders from all corners of the globe, tenancy in the Twin Towers continued to drop. The towers presented another problem. Decades ago, their steel beams had been sprayed with fireproof asbestos, a cancer-causing material banned from use in building in the mid-1980s. Although the World Trade Center complex was given several waivers, it was expected to clean up its act. But to remove the asbestos from every supporting beam in the Twin Towers would have been almost undoable. Quotes for this cleanup ran over $1 billion, and no insurance company was willing to bear the cost. An urban renewal project of unfathomable proportions. Given the tower's issues and problems, September 11th proved an unexpected bonanza. The Trade Center was built in the 1960s to revive a rundown area of New York, and 40 years later, urban renewal could again take place. 2 white elephants were removed, and a brand new complex is in the works. As last survivor William Rodriguez climbed the stairwell to rescue people, he remembers a very strange thing.
As I stood there on the 33rd floor, I heard very strange noises on the 34th floor. Now, the 34th floor was an empty floor, a floor that did not have any kind of walls, or it was a construction floor. It was totally hollowed out. There was nothing there, and I heard very heavy equipment being moved around, and it sounded like dumpsters with metal wheels being moved around, and I got scared because I knew it was an empty floor. Nobody was supposed to be there. As a matter of fact, not even the elevators stopped there. You have to have a special access key to open the door on the 34th floor. So to find that there were strange noises there, and I continue actually bypassing that floor because I didn't dare to open the door on the 34th floor.
Something told William Rodriguez not to mess with the 34th floor. I got scared. Yet William Rodriguez was not a man who was scared that day. He remained in a burning building against firemen's orders, endangering his own life as he saved the lives of others. What could have been happening on the 34th floor? For weeks, Scott Forbes had heard similar noises on the 98th floor above him.
It must have been at least 4 to 6 weeks before 9/11. It was like rebuilding work going on upstairs. The tenants, the people from Aon who had been removed somewhere else, the offices were just vacant. And there was a lot of heavy machinery building work going on. It was almost like pneumatic drills and lots of hammering, so much so that the floors were shaking. That's how noticeable it was. It was almost as if something heavy was being moved and then it was being taken off wheels, and it was like boom. Our floor underneath literally shook. You could feel the weight above you. That was how large it was. On one occasion, I opened a door to see what was going on, being nosy. When I opened the door, the whole office space was empty. There was nothing there at all. It was quite bizarre because it was just empty. Completely empty, barren, nothing, zero. Not even cables hanging from the ceiling, but there'd been these heavy noises and vibrations up above. It was really strange.
And the noticeable dust in the building the week before.
It was probably the week leading up to 9/11. Every morning I'd come in around 7 a.m. and the dust was incredible. It was filthy. It was like the cleaners weren't cleaning. Right where the windows were, there was a sill which enclosed radiators. I was sick to death of the dust which was appearing on the windowsills. It was dirty grey and very, very noticeable in that week leading up to 9/11. Where was that dust coming from?
Grey dust Scott himself had to clean. Was it powdered cement? The steel columns of the Twin Towers formed an endo and exoskeleton. Had something been placed around the edge of the building, holes been drilled to contain it? Was the dust in those final days a telltale sign? As white elephants, the buildings were full of vacant offices. Tenants could be temporarily moved around for upgrades as Aon was, and a plan arranged to perfection. Was the strange construction that could be heard but not seen going on all over the towers? Larry Silverstein took possession 6 weeks before September 11th, when the strange construction began. Were the sounds that scared William Rodriguez the last of the rats as they left a sinking ship?
When I started looking through the 9/11 Commission report, I was outraged. I mean, millions of Americans were looking to this report, this book, to tell them what actually happened on September 11th, 2001. And they were doing so under the assumption that there had been a clear, open inquiry into the events, that all of the relevant questions had been asked and evidence had been provided. And this clearly was not the case.
Well, the Keane report on 9/11, which was finally set up, I think is not a serious examination of what happened and what the causes were. I say that, first of all, because clearly the Bush administration didn't want to do it. They resisted all the calls for an official inquiry for several months. And what actually finally persuaded them to do this was not the politicians in Congress. It was the families, the wives of those who were killed at 9/11.
The first thing it does is name the 19 hijackers, the mostly Saudi nationals. But of course we heard within days of the events that something like 5 or 6 of these people were still alive and well and living in the Middle East. Why wasn't this addressed in the 9/11 Commission report? Why wasn't there some inquiry as to who were the real hijackers if in fact the people who had been identified were clearly not the right people?
And on the day itself, which I think is the most significant evidence, the first plane hit at 8:46 a.m., the Southern Tower at about 9:05 a.m. The third plane hit the Pentagon at 9:38 a.m. They knew there was a hijack between 8:10 and 8:20 in the morning, let's say 8:15, so they knew half an hour before the first plane, 3/4 of an hour before the second plane, and an hour and a half before the third plane hit their targets. And not once in that time did they scramble a warplane to intercept. Now that is just staggering.
First, Bush tried to stop Congress from setting up its own 9/11 investigation.
It's important for us to not reveal how we collect information. That's what the enemy wants. And we're fighting an enemy.
When he couldn't stop Congress, he then tried to stop an independent 9/11 commission from being formed.
The president's position was a break from history. Independent investigations were launched within days of Pearl Harbor and President Kennedy's assassination.
But when Congress did complete its own investigation, the Bush White House censored 28 pages of the report.
The president is being pressed by all sides to declassify the report.
We have given extraordinary cooperation with Chairman Keane and Hamilton.
We haven't gotten the materials we needed, and we certainly haven't gotten them in a timely fashion. The deadlines we set have passed.
Will you testify before the commission?
This commission? You know, I don't testify. I mean, I'd be glad to visit with them.
The president named a supporter, Dr. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State in the Nixon and Ford administrations, to head the panel.
He has a penchant for secrecy, which is not what's needed here. There are questions about his role in Vietnam, his role in the coup in Chile.
Several family members approached Kissinger and requested a meeting at his office in New York. Prior to the meeting, Kristen Breitweiser conducted a thorough investigation of Kissinger's potential conflicts of interest.
Probably much to the chagrin of some of the people in the room, Lori asked some very pointed questions. Would you have any Saudi American clients that you would like to tell us about? And he was very uncomfortable, kind of twisting and turning on the couch. And then she asked whether he had any clients by the name of Bin Laden. And he just about fell off his couch.
Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger stepped down from the position Friday.
We thought the meeting went well.
I wouldn't want to be in the way of some of these families. I mean, they're...
Kissinger was soon replaced by Tom Keene, a former New Jersey governor, and former Congressman Lee Hamilton, who had chaired the House Intelligence Committee. The president and vice president agreed to meet with the commission, but with a catch. They insisted on meeting together behind closed doors and not under oath.
President, why are you and the Vice President insisting on appearing together before the 9/11 Commission?
Because the 9/11 Commission wants to ask us questions. That's why we're meeting, and I look forward to meeting with them and answering their questions.
Why you're appearing together rather than separately, which was their request?
Because it's a good chance for both of us to answer questions that the 9/11 Commission is looking forward to asking us, and I'm looking forward to answering them. Let's see.
We have to have one story, so I'll say part, and if I get it wrong, hedge a little bit and give me the next.
I want to thank the chairman and vice chairman for giving us a chance to share views on different subjects. And they had a lot of good questions, and I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I took the time.
What topic did the commissioners want to spend most of the time on?
It's probably best that I not go into the details of the conversation.
The president and vice president of the United States, don't you think they should be able to stand up and speak their own words?
They should go under oath.
They should be, yeah.
In public.
Don't you think that the families deserve to have a transcript or to be able to see what you
Adam,
said?
you asked me that question yesterday. I got the same answer, yeah.
The chairman of the commission is Republican, and even more importantly, the executive director is a Republican. And this executive director, Philip Zelikow, is not just any old Republican. He was a member of the National Security Council of the Bush I administration, where he worked with Condoleezza Rice. Then during the Clinton years, when the Republicans were out of office, he and Condoleezza Rice co-authored a book. And I have co-authored a book with somebody, and I know you have to be very good friends and you have to share almost all beliefs in common. He then worked for the transition team for the National Security Council for the transition between the Clinton and Bush administrations. And finally then, he was appointed to Bush's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. So the commission is definitely not independent, if you mean independent from the White House, because the executive director represents the perspective of the White House. Now, why is this important? The executive director directed the work of the staff, and the staff of the commission, not the commissioners, did almost all the work. And as director of the staff, he decided which lines of inquiry were worthy to be looked into and which ones should not. Therefore, as executive director, Zelikow could direct the staff to investigate those events that were relevant to the official conspiracy theory and simply ignore all events that would be supportive of the alternative conspiracy theory. Some critics, having read the 9/11 Commission report, have called it the 9/11 Omission Report. Well, this is a good name because it systematically excludes virtually every fact supporting the alternative theory. Some people have also called it a whitewash, and it is. But this term assumes that the Commission should have investigated the White House, that is, various kinds of evidence suggesting that there was complicity by the White House. But given Zelikow's position, any investigation of the White House would have been carried out by, essentially, the White House itself. A more accurate way to put it was that as the White House's inside man on the Commission, Zelikow was in position to make sure that the White House, along with the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon, and the Justice Department, was not investigated. Once we understand this, we will not be surprised by the Commission's omissions.
Yeah, right.
When a crime has been committed, any good investigator will ask the question, who benefits? So let's apply this reasoning to the main parties associated with the events of 9/11. Osama bin Laden. 5 days after 9/11, bin Laden stated that he had no knowledge of the attacks. He also stated that the attacks appear to have been carried out by individuals with their own motivation. This statement was aired only once on Al Jazeera TV on the 16th of September 2001. Before 9/11, Osama bin Laden had lived as a fugitive, but he was a wealthy fugitive who had enjoyed relative freedom outside of the USA. He was even able to obtain kidney dialysis treatment at an American hospital in Dubai just prior to 9/11. And within Afghanistan, his country of residence, he was protected by the Taliban, who had full control of the country. However, after 9/11, bin Laden's life became increasingly worse. For example, he was now unable to stay within the comfort zone of Afghanistan because the country had been invaded by the coalition forces. Bin Laden was also unable to freely visit other countries for hospital treatment because those countries would risk being accused of harboring a wanted terrorist. He would therefore have to spend even more of his money on protection, plus his future options would be extremely limited in terms of survival, finding a place to stay, finding the hospital treatment he needed, and planning future terror attacks. Numerous news reports from 2002 stated that bin Laden had in fact died. So when it comes to the question of who benefited from 9/11, on a scale of 0 to 10, Osama bin Laden scores 0. Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was created by the CIA during the 1980s for the purpose of fighting off an attempted Russian invasion of Afghanistan. The CIA funded Al-Qaeda and supplied them with the weapons and intelligence they needed to ward off the Russian threat. When the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in the late 1980s, the CIA continued to fund Al-Qaeda, and many of its operatives were used as CIA assets. These operatives were used as double agents for use in anti-terrorism drills within the USA and for covert military operations. Since 9/11, Al-Qaeda would have found it almost impossible to carry out major terrorist attacks in countries like the USA. For example, the Patriot Act in the USA allows the government to spy on all phone and email communications. So life for any terrorist organization will have become immeasurably worse since 9/11. In addition to this, the invasion of Afghanistan and the loss of so many of Al-Qaeda's main operatives would have seriously disrupted and undermined Al-Qaeda's ability to function as a terror group in the future. So when it comes to the question of who benefited from 9/11, on a scale of 0 to 10, Al-Qaeda scores 0. Saddam Hussein. Up until 9/11, Saddam enjoyed a relatively comfortable life as the dictator of Iraq. However, since 9/11, Saddam's life had become progressively worse. Firstly, because of the constant insinuations that Saddam had something to do with 9/11, and secondly, because of the accusations that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction. Within 18 months of 9/11, Iraq was invaded and Saddam was reduced to living in squalid conditions whilst on the run from his invaders. Shortly after the invasion of Iraq, Saddam was captured after he was found hiding in a small underground spider hole in a derelict house in Tikrit. He was held as a prisoner for 3 years before being tried and hanged. The Iraqi court found Saddam guilty of crimes that he committed during the 1980s. So when it comes to the question of who benefited from 9/11, on a scale of 0 to 10, Saddam Hussein scores less than 0. So, out of the three parties who've had the finger pointed at them by the Bush administration for complicity in the 9/11 attacks, none of them have benefited politically, financially, or strategically from what happened on 9/11. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. The lives of these three parties have been turned upside down to the point where they can no longer function as they did before 9/11. So who did benefit from 9/11? Larry Silverstein. This man became the leaseholder of the World Trade Center complex just a few weeks before 9/11. Silverstein faced the daunting task of having to remove the illegal asbestos that covered every steel beam in the Twin Towers. This job would have cost over $1 billion. When Silverstein took possession of the World Trade Center complex, he reworked the insurance policy on the complex to specifically cover terrorist attacks. After 9/11, Silverstein received $7 billion compensation from his insurers. That's a massive profit on his original $15 million investment. So when it comes to the question of who benefited from 9/11, on a scale of 0 to 10, Larry Silverstein scores 10. The project for the new American century. In September of 2000, these men produced a neocon manifesto called Project for the New American Century, or PNAC for short. This manifesto detailed their ambitions and intentions for America in the 21st century. It called for the transformation of America into tomorrow's dominant force through permanent military bases in the Middle East. It also wanted to establish America as a global constabulary, unchallenged by the UN and the rest of the world. It also called for regime change in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. But it said that fulfilling these ambitions would be a long process unless there was a catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Within 12 months of producing the PNAC manifesto, the events of 9/11 took place, and the new neocon administration was able to carry out virtually every ambition called for in their PNAC manifesto. So when it comes to the question of who benefited from 9/11, on a scale of 0 to 10, the PNAC group scores 10. Dick Cheney. The current Vice President and former CEO of Halliburton still receives a multi-year deferred salary package from Halliburton, whose stock has increased considerably since the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. The arms industry. There is nothing better for the arms industry than a war. Since 9/11, billions of dollars worth of missiles and bombs have been used and have to be replaced, and President Bush is asking for and receiving additional defense funds. He is the man to spend those billions of dollars and give them to his friends and business partners, who in turn support his political career, not least with money. As part of the Carlyle Group, the Bush family have already gained huge profits from the company's manufacture of weapons and military bases since 9/11. So when it comes to the question of who benefited from 9/11, on a scale of 0 to 10, Bush, Cheney and the arms industry scores 10. US oil companies. Again, a business field where President Bush is involved. Over 60% of the world's oil fields happen to be in the Middle East. The current supply of oil used by the US, which is the world's biggest oil consumer, will be exceeded by demand within the next 10 years or so. Without gaining control of that 60% of oil in the Middle East, the US economy would soon collapse. So it is essential for America to gain control of those oil fields in the Middle East as soon as possible. Not just for its own use, but also to control the supply of that oil to other countries such as China, which will soon become the most powerful nation on Earth. Since the 1980s, US oil interests have wanted to build an oil pipeline from the Caspian oil fields down through Afghanistan. They wanted to do this in order to control the supply of oil to countries such as China. However, the Taliban, who occupied Afghanistan at the time, refused to allow the US to build this pipeline. However, just one day after America installed its own government in Afghanistan, the contract was signed to construct the pipeline they desperately wanted. So when it comes to the question of who benefited from 9/11, on a scale of 0 to 10, the American oil companies scored 10. The US government. The terrorist attacks on 9/11 gave the US government the excuse to further pursue its goal of a new world order by means of war. The Patriot Act allows the government to spy on the communications of every citizen. It also allows the sampling of DNA of any person convicted of any crime of violence. And it also allows arrest on suspicion, without a warrant, without probable cause, in secret, without notifying anybody, and without the right to see a lawyer. So the people who've been blamed for 9/11, i.e. Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, have gained nothing from 9/11 and lost everything as a result of 9/11. Whereas the people who pointed the finger of blame, i.e. Bush, Cheney and the Peanut Group, gained everything they had wanted as a direct result of 9/11. The same is true of the World Trade Center leaseholder, Larry Silverstein, and of course US oil and arms companies.
George Bush is very convincing that he saw the first plane strike the World Trade Center the morning of 9/11 on regular TV. He provides supporting details, has repeated the story, and never retracted it. It has run on the White House website.
According to the official White House version, it was at this moment in a Florida classroom that Bush learned the second plane had hit the World Trade Center and that the U.S. was under attack. But here's what George Bush himself said almost 3 months later when asked about September 11th.
Well, Jordan, you're not going to believe what state I was in when I heard about the terrorist attack. I was in Florida. And my chief of staff, Andy Card, well, actually I was in a classroom talking about a reading program that works. And was sitting outside the classroom waiting to go in, and I saw an airplane hit the tower of a TV. You know, the TV was obviously on. I used to fly myself, and I said, well, there's one terrible pilot. And it said it must have been a horrible accident. But I was whisked off there. I didn't have much time to think about it.
Could George Bush have seen on ordinary TV the first plane hit the World Trade Center? No, he could not have. The footage of that first strike only shows up on television the next day, September the 12th, 2001. It was taken by a French documentary crew that happened to be in downtown New York. It can be suggested Bush confuses the second plane with the first. But how to explain this? We've all seen Andy Card do that. None of this can ever be retracted. It is an interlocking historical record. Why go on at length about this? Because it may one day become the basis for criminal court proceedings.
Describe the design of planned attacks on buildings inside the U.S. and how operatives were directed to carry them out. That is valuable information for those of us who have the responsibility to protect the American people. He told us the operatives had been instructed to ensure that the explosives went off at a point that was high enough to prevent people trapped above from escaping. He told us the operatives had been instructed to ensure that the explosives went off at a point that was high enough to prevent people trapped above from escaping. To ensure that the explosives went off.
I know you said there'll be a time for politics, but you've also said you wanted to change the tone of Washington. Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, you know, it's time for politics. And It's an absurd insinuation.
In that case, sir, can I follow up on something unrelated?
In 2001, after the World Trade Center bombing, my detachment was alerted to deploy to Afghanistan to conduct unconventional warfare operations. In 2001, after the World Trade Center bombing, I
have a sense, if we imagine the kind of world we would face if the people who bombed the Best Hall in Mosul, or the people who did the bombing in Spain, or the people who attacked the United States in New York, shot down the plane over Pennsylvania and attacked the Pentagon, shot down the plane over Pennsylvania, shot down the plane over Pennsylvania.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Outrageous. Simply outrageous. It takes months of preparation and planning to do a controlled demolition like this one. They had to have put these charges in place before September 11th. Larry Silverstein was kind enough to tell us that they demolished this building on September 11th. But who was they? And are we supposed to think that they didn't have explosive charges in place in the Twin Towers?
The leaseholder of the World Trade Center complex, Larry Silverstein, gave a public interview on PBS in 2002, and he said that they pulled that building, which is a demolition term for intentionally bringing down a building. This man made over $5 billion from those buildings' destruction, and I want to know if there was ever a formal investigation into Larry Silverstein, the leaseholder of the World Trade Center complex, and his ties to this entire event.
I don't believe there's been a formal investigation. I haven't heard that. I don't know that. I do know that that wall, I remember, was in danger, and I think that they made a decision based on the danger that it had of destroying other things, that they did it in a controlled fashion.
If the official story is true, and an astoundingly successful sneak attack from diabolical Muslims caught America totally off guard, then the White House surely must be highly motivated to turn heaven and earth, to use one of their own favorite cliches, to investigate the events of that day as quickly and thoroughly as possible. The White House must rush to appoint a respected chairman and commissioners, give them the widest powers to call witnesses, spare no expense. Except for the Reichstag fire, that's how it's usually done. 6 days after the sinking of the Titanic, a chairman is appointed to head an investigation. 9 days after Pearl Harbor, the first of 4 investigative commissions is struck. The JFK assassination, the Challenger disaster, 7 days each. How many days after 9/11 is it that President Bush named someone to head an investigation?
This commission has been charged with a crucial task.
Call it foot-dragging. The White House chooses all the commissioners, key insiders rife with conflicts of interest. The editor of Vanity Fair, Graydon Carter, sums it up. The Bush White House did everything in its power to derail an open inquiry. Then, when faced with its inevitability, the President and his aides sought to limit its scope, its access, and its funding. This commission was about as independent from White House control and manipulation as the abused prisoners at Abu Ghraib were from their jailers. Mandate. The commission itself says, we're not out to blame anyone. In other words, accountability is not part of the mandate. Budget? In January 2003, the Bush administration allots the commission $3 million. This compares to $5 million for a 1996 commission that looked into casino gambling. and $50 million each for the inquiries into the Columbia shuttle explosion and the Clintons' failed Whitewater deal. The dollar amount is later grudgingly raised but never exceeds $15 million. The White House releases only 25% of 11,000 documents requested. It blacks out portions of the released documents, resists requests that the administration officials testify under oath, and tries to rush the commission's deadline. After a cat-and-mouse game, Bush and Cheney meet the commission. But it is behind closed doors. They refuse to testify under oath. No tape recorders are allowed. No transcript is allowed. Bush makes no opening statement, and those taking notes must submit them to security personnel. All of this is what is called in law guilty demeanor. The behavior of the White House in relation to the commission from start to finish only makes sense if the official story is a lie and the truth needs to be kept secret.
You know, George Bush has said that anybody that has any connections to Al-Qaeda, should be arrested. Well, no one has greater connections to the Saudis and the House of bin Laden than the Bushes. They've been in business together for decades. George Bush actually started his first oil company way back in 1976 with a member of the bin Laden family and with their funds. My friends, the government had complete and total prior knowledge of the horrible events that happened here. And at the bare minimum, they allowed this tragedy to take place as a pretext to scare the population into total abject fear and then submission. In his film Fahrenheit 9/11, Michael Moore doesn't even talk about things that MSNBC and the Associated Press have reported on. That Osama bin Laden's code name in the CIA was Tim Osman. That he was a CIA asset trained in the 1970s and used against the Russians in the 1980s in Afghanistan. Then, of course, he helped against the Serbs in the late 1990s. Over and over again, Osama bin Laden has been used as a tool of the U.S. government and its interests. Anytime they need to create a crisis anywhere on the planet, bin Laden comes to their rescue as the fire starter they need to create the crisis so they can offer their solution. Or why didn't you talk about the huge 9/11 truth movement that sprung up right after 9/11, made up of hundreds of the victims' families of September 11th, alleging government involvement in the attacks? Why didn't the film talk about the official U.S. government plan to carry out terror attacks in America and blame it on foreign enemies? Operation Northwoods. It even called for hijacking jets by remote control and crashing them, bombing D.C., committing sniper attacks. No, Michael Moore didn't discuss this. Something ABC News and the Baltimore Sun were willing to do, Michael Moore wouldn't get near. In the 3 days after September 11, 2001, over 160 members of Osama bin Laden's family were flown out of the country to Saudi Arabia. This at a time when all commercial and private air traffic was grounded by the Pentagon. But that wasn't the only airlift. Seymour Hersh first broke the story at the New Yorker magazine about the airlift of evil. It was then picked up by major publications, but, well, forgotten into the memory hole. At the end of the 3-week-long Afghan war in Afghanistan, 8,000 Taliban and Al-Qaeda leaders were loaded on U.S. government C-130s and flown out to Pakistan to safety. It had been their job to stir up the phony crisis in Afghanistan and then give George W. the fake victory. You see, it was a staged war. And this is one of the other big smoking guns of 9/11 government involvement that we're all supposed to forget about. Oh, the government admits they flew them out to safety, but Fox News said it was an accident. Yes, 8,000 Taliban and Al-Qaeda cream the leaders being flown out to safety. And top generals were told to release Taliban generals. They were told, let them go. And some of the generals got angry and went public. The FBI has gone public, as well as the CIA. They've even leaked the orders, like W199I, where George Bush ordered them to back off Osama bin Laden and his family. In fact, they even fired some agents that refused to follow their orders. There were red flags everywhere. Everyone knew that the attack was coming. That's why so many public officials didn't go to New York. But months before, there was the Bush administration frustrating the investigations, ordering the agents off the cases, ensuring that the attacks would go forward. Then there were the media reports by respected institutions, backed up by hospital officials at the American hospital in Dubai, of Osama bin Laden meeting with the CIA Middle East section chief for 10 days in July of 2001, months before September 11th. The question is, what was the CIA doing meeting with Osama bin Laden? Getting their story straight?
Not just the campaign cash for George W. and Brother Jeb. There was $1 billion the U.S. Treasury pumped into Brother Neil's bank, Silverado. And there's Brother Marvin. His investment funds are fattening on contracts for the war on terror. And Daddy, Bush Sr., became the first ex-president to sell his Oval Office connections for cash to oil companies and arms dealers. The Bushes are like other American dynasties. The Kennedys, the Rockefellers. But they've taken the game to a whole other level. See, the money gets them office, then the office gets them even more money. Call it the Bush cycle. And it's still rolling along. I went to speak to a man who'd witnessed the Bush family's uncanny ability to turn government service into cash. He'd occupied an inside seat in the spook world during the Reagan-Bush administration. Former National Security Agent Wayne Madsen.
It's the nature of the Bush families, particularly Bush Sr., to use contacts made from government service, head of the CIA, vice president, president of the United States, to basically call in favors later on.
Bush Sr. and other former intelligence and political honchos have joined the private Carlyle Group, whose main work is selling arms to the U.S. government and a few dictatorships.
Carlyle uses Senior Bush to make entrees to various government offices around the world, to presidents and prime ministers and kings, sheikhs, emirs, sultans, what have you. But what Bush Sr. gets in return is he's part of these lucrative contracts, and he uses his connections to funnel the money into the Bush family coffers, which finds its way into the Bush campaign machine.
In 1988, George Bush Sr. won the presidency. At this time, a contract was awarded by the government of Bahrain to drill for oil in the Persian Gulf. Surprisingly, it went to a small-time Texas oil driller, Harken Energy, who had little experience in the field. I asked investigative reporter Pete Bruton, then with the Houston Chronicle, how this happened.
Harken Oil in Texas gets an offshore contract to drill in the Persian Gulf.
It was a big mystery to everyone. All the analysts, everybody said, how did this happen? Nobody understood why it happened. Why didn't Amoco, why didn't Texaco, Mobil, Exxon, BP, why didn't they get the contract? They had the capital. Harken didn't have any capital. And I found out it was because George W. Bush, the president's son, and our future president, was on the board of directors.
This document is marked secret and WF, which means it walked its way out of the Washington Bureau of the FBI. It indicates that before the attack of September 11th, agents had wanted to question two members of a very powerful family for their connections to a suspected terrorist organization, Omar and Abdullah bin Laden. But the agents weren't allowed to. Now, what makes this family so special that they're protected from investigation? To find out what lay behind the Bush administration's reluctance to look into the bin Laden family, I went back to speak to our fighter pilot, Bill White. He went into business with a mysterious figure, James R. Bath, who managed the U.S. funds of a powerful Saudi family.
I met many times with Salim bin Laden, Osama bin Laden's older brother, both in business settings and in social settings. We had parties there where a lot of the dignitaries and big business bigwigs would party with the Arabs, so It was like La La Land. These guys drove around in limousines with suitcases full of cash. It was just amazing.
And those suitcases full of cash found their way from bin Laden to a man named James R. Bath.
Bath actually presented me with a copy of a trust agreement, a one-page trust agreement that was signed in 1976 that appointed him as sole and exclusive representative for the Saudi bin Laden family in the United States of America and all their business ventures.
And that bin Laden money allowed Bath to invest in another flyboy, our future president.
Oh, that's right, George Bush Jr. and our Busto. That's correct.
Do you know about that?
Well, I know about it because Jim and I had to provide our personal financials to our lenders, and so I looked at his personal financial, and they're, plain as day. It said, our Busto 79, $25,000, or Busto 80, $25,000.
So Bush's oil capital came from Bath, and Bath's money came apparently from the bin Ladens. But why would they plow money into W's oil company?
The money that Bath put into our Busto was nothing but an extension of this quid pro quo relationship between the Saudi royal family and the Bushes. The Saudi royal family was deathly afraid of the Ayatollah Khomeini and the radical Islamic movement. And so at that point in time, they went to the Bushes and said, look, protect us from the Ayatollah and these radical fundamentalists, and we'll give you whatever you want for your campaigns and to fund your kids' business interests, to fight your secret wars.
In order to truly understand what happened on September the 11th and the close relationship between the Bushes, the bin Ladens, and the rest of the Saudi elite, you have to go back about 25 years and south a couple of thousand kilometers to Houston, Texas, where in the mid-1970s George W. Bush was a young man just trying to learn the ropes in his family's two businesses, politics and oil. George Sr. struck it rich in oil, became a congressman, then director of the Central Intelligence Agency, where it's said he first won the friendship of the Saudi royal family by arranging CIA training for their palace guards. And George Jr. was trying to follow in his father's footsteps. A Harvard business grad, he dabbled in politics and the Texas Air National Guard. And it was about the same time that a man named Bill White, a former fighter pilot with a Harvard MBA himself, was recruited to work in Houston with someone with business and personal connections to both George Bushes. His name was Jim Bath.
This fellow, James R. Bath, needed someone to run a series of real estate companies that would be grubstaked by not only the political families, but also by some foreign nationals, the Saudis. And so I came down on an interview and met Jim.
They opened an office in downtown Houston, where Bill White became Jim Bath's partner and confidant. But White says Bath spent most of his time dealing with his foreign partners, a wealthy Saudi family, the bin Ladens.
He also ran a company in the same building called Bin Laden and Associates, which Jim explained was a procurement company for the Saudis. He bought a bank for them, he bought an airport for them, he started an airline for them, among other ventures in Houston, Texas.
Now at that point, had you ever heard the name Bin Laden?
No, I had not.
Meant nothing to you?
Meant nothing to me.
But in Saudi Arabia, the bin Laden's name meant a great deal indeed. They owned one of the largest Saudi construction companies. They were advisors to the royal family. They were the second richest family next to the royals, with billions of dollars to invest abroad in places like Houston, where the Bush family lived. They moved into this estate in one of Houston's finest neighborhoods. A bin Laden brother named Salam bin Laden, and a brother-in-law, Khalid bin Mahfouz. Mahfouz was also one of the Saudi royal family's bankers.
So is it fair to say that when the bin Laden group establishes an office in Houston, the presence of the Bush family at that point had a lot to do with it?
Oh, absolutely. I think that was essential, the essential element. And I don't think any of those dollars would have come into the United States or any of those assets been purchased had not there been this quid pro quo relationship with the Bush family.
While the bin Ladens built their ties to Texas, back home in Saudi Arabia they were making another kind of foreign investment. In 1979, the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan. The Saudi royal family wanted to build a Muslim army, known as the Mujahideen, to defend Islam and force the Russians out. They turned to their trusted advisors, the bin Ladens, who offered up a lanky 21-year-old named Osama. The man who personally chose Osama bin Laden to build that army would also become his mentor, Saudi Prince Turki Al Faisal. Last year on British television, he reminisced about the young bin Laden.
In those days, he was a young man who had committed himself to helping the Afghan Mujahideen liberate themselves from the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And he was doing a lot of good. He was bringing support and aid to the Mujahideen.
Meanwhile, back in Houston, the Bush family was also on the move. George Sr. was about to become vice president, and his son made a career decision too. By the late 70s, George W. Bush was setting out on his own. He established an oil exploration company that he called Arbusto, a Spanish word that loosely translated means bush. But before Arbusto could find oil, it needed to find some money, operating capital. And apparently George Bush knew where to look.
Well, Bath had told me that he had used Saudi money to fund George Bush Jr.'s foray into the energy business.
This is the Arbusto Corporation?
Yes, the Arbusto Partnerships.
As Bath's partner, Bill White, says he had access to information about the financial dealings between the bin Laden family and George W. Bush. He later obtained Bath's personal financial statements when the two had a falling out and became involved in litigation.
On schedules that show his partnership interests, he shows a personal partnership interest of $25,000 invested in Arbusto 79 and another $25,000 investment in Bush 80.
But according to White, that share was only Bath's commission for investing the bin Laden's money with Bush.
Do you have any knowledge of how much money the Saudis put in?
Well, he told me it was in excess of, $1 million.
So there's no question in your mind whatsoever that whatever went into George W. Bush's companies from Jim Bath was money from the Saudis.
100% of it was Saudi money.
And George W. Bush would have been aware of that?
Oh, absolutely.
But that wasn't all. A few years later, another oil company in which George W. Bush was involved needed cash. It got a reported $25 million, again, thanks in part to Bush's old Houston neighbor, Khalid bin Mahfouz, Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law. And it wasn't only George Bush the son who benefited. The bin Ladens did business with the Houston bank where George Bush Sr. was on the board.
What time is it? Victory time. This is the non-political part of this.
And businessman Bill White says whether Bush Sr. knew it or not, the bin Ladens were also generous with him when he ran for president in 1988, allegedly finding a way around the U.S. ban on foreign campaign contributions.
My understanding from Bath was that they were making campaign contributions by taking briefcases full of cash to the law firms. They would give the cash to the lawyers, and then each of the lawyers in turn would make a $1,000 campaign contribution to Bush.
Which would presumably be against electoral law in the U.S.
Well, it is against the law, but it's obviously covered by virtue of the attorneys making the contributions.
And when George Bush Sr. became president, as with George W. more than a decade later, the Saudis occupied a special place at the White House, the Oval Office always open to one man, Saudi Arabia's ambassador, Prince Bandar.
He's got instant access. He calls them up, says, I'm coming over. He's got instant access to the CIA, anybody he wants. He can summon people. He can call anybody up at home at any time, which most ambassadors in Washington cannot do.
Robert Baer served with the CIA for 21 years and spent much of that time in the Middle East.
What is the George W. Bush calls Bandar? Bandar Bush?
Bandar Bush, yeah, he calls him Bandar Bush. You know, that's fine. Bandar's a great ambassador. It works great until you turn a blind eye, until you believe everything Bandar says.
Baer believes that Bandar's position is symptomatic of the blind self-interest on both sides. That's the Saudi-American relationship's fatal flaw. It's a lesson George W. Bush and his administration wouldn't learn until it was much too late.
Had Saudi Arabia been acting as one might expect a true ally and friend to act, could they have told the U.S. all they needed to know about the real threat posed by bin Laden?
They knew everything. They were the source of fundings that went to buy arms, to buy bombs through their charities. And those charities in Saudi Arabia are all controlled by the government to some extent.
It was 1991. The Gulf War was over. American troops had defended Saudi oil fields against Saddam Hussein. Now the U.S. could continue to enjoy the economic security which came with all that Saudi oil. It was essentially the same deal George W. Bush himself made when he did business with the bin Ladens in Houston. One side got a powerful partner, the other oil and money. Former CIA agent Robert Baer.
The United States depends upon Saudi Arabia for its oil production. Saudi Arabia also recycles all the money it makes off oil in the United States and puts trillions of dollars in our banks. It pays for presidential libraries, anything you can imagine.
And the Clinton White House wasn't immune to Saudi charm either. It was difficult not to give the benefit of the doubt to the biggest buyer of American military hardware with the deepest pockets in the stock market, not to mention the world's largest oil reserves. Which is why after George Bush Sr. left office and became a senior advisor to the powerful international investment firm, the Carlyle Group, he paid a number of visits on their behalf to his good friends, the Saudi royal family and the bin Ladens.
A very nice reunion with friends. I'm very pleased to be here.
They soon became Carlyle clients. Incredibly, on September 11th, Bush and the head of the bin Laden family would be at the same Carlyle Group meeting in Washington, just a few miles from where Osama bin Laden's hijackers would attack the Pentagon.
Osama bin Laden is not an easy subject. Characterizations of him vary wildly. The most common, because it's the official narrative of cardboard cutout simplicity, is that he's the world's #1 villain, the diabolical mastermind behind the events of September 11th. Another view, Osama is the conscience of Islam. Well, globally, Osama is like a Rorschach ink blot. His character and role morph into what various publics project upon him, based on what they're led to believe. Take books. There's an adage you can't tell a book by its cover. Maybe so, but you can tell it by its index. Bin Laden, the man who declared war on America, is by Joseph Bodansky, former senior consultant to the Pentagon and U.S. State Department. Bodansky explains a vast global conspiracy, it says in the foreword. The index entries on bin Laden in this 440-page book run almost 2 pages. But there are just 4 references to the CIA, mostly brief, and they reveal nothing. Yet the decades-long $8 billion CIA covert operation in Afghanistan was also its largest ever, according to numerous sources, including journalist John Cooley in his book, Unholy Wars, Afghanistan, America, and International Terrorism. Contrast the Bodansky book with this one, Taliban, by Ahmed Rashid. He's a Pakistani journalist who's covered Afghanistan for 21 years. In his index are 8 entries about bin Laden and 11 about the CIA. Now back to bin Laden. What do most sources agree on? We know bin Laden is born in Saudi Arabia in 1957. Okay, we're not sure about the year. His father becomes a close friend of the king and fabulously wealthy. Bin Laden Corporation becomes one of the largest construction companies in the Middle East. In this business, you're dealing with the Pakistani intelligence, the ISI, Saudi intelligence, the CIA. With his family's blessing, Osama becomes closely associated with the CIA in the Afghan war against the Soviets. Bin Laden Corp, Ahmed writes, built major training camps for the CIA. In 1986, he helped build the Coast Tunnel Complex, which the CIA was funding as a major arms storage depot, training facility, and medical center for the Mujahideen. At this point, bin Laden's story, like Stephen Leacock's horse, rides madly off in all directions. My questions: did he turn against the CIA? Maintain ties while making anti-American statements? Was he manipulated? Former associates describe him as deeply impressionable, always in need of mentors. Rashid writes, "You're forced to turn to a larger canvas," as in the final draft of this to-be-published book, The War on Freedom, Causes and Consequences of 9/11, by Nafeez Ahmed, Executive Director of the Institute for Policy Research and Development in Brighton, England. He's an Oxfam campaigner who specializes in writing international reports on human rights. News of his reports have been carried by Reuters, Associated Press, The Guardian, The Independent, The Jewish Chronicle, and the London Jewish News. Ahmed writes that bin Laden is merely a piece in a chess game. The stakes of the game are the last of the world's oil reserves and the Bush administration's consolidation of power to pursue a drastic, unlimited militarization of foreign policy on a massive and unprecedented scale required by long-standing elite planning while crushing domestic dissent and criminalizing legitimate protest. I believe that if we shrink from testing Ahmed's overview and accept only the headlines of the day, we will fail to see the forest for the trees. The USA helped recruit, train, and equip thousands of killer mujahideen in the anti-Soviet war. Ahmed's book and other evidence shows the recruiting of and training of terrorists, including those in Al-Qaeda, has continued for years. The White House went underground with this aid. This is detailed in the 1993 book, The Outlaw Bank, A Wild Ride into the Secret Heart of BCCI. BCCI stands for Bank of Credit and Commerce International. It collapsed after exposure of its massive fraud and corruption. The book's authors are Jonathan Beatty and S.C. Gwynne. Beatty was an investigative reporter and senior correspondent for Time magazine. Gwynne, Time's economics editor and author of Selling Money. Further evidence of the long and deep involvement of the CIA in terrorism is found in the 1987 book, Crimes of Patriots, a true tale of dope, dirty money, and the CIA, by Jonathan Whitney. Whitney, at the time, had been a Wall Street Journal reporter for 16 years. He wrote that neither the director of the CIA nor the deputy director had, in his career, shown any reluctance to shed American or foreign blood in covert.
We have not seen one piece of evidence that links Osama bin Laden directly to the planning stages of September 11th.
This failure to provide proof was later said to be unnecessary because bin Laden, in a video allegedly found in Afghanistan, admitted responsibility for the attacks. But the man in this video has darker skin, fuller cheeks, and a broader nose than the Osama bin Laden of all other videos. We again seem to have planted evidence.
The head of Pakistani intelligence at the ISI, Mahmoud Ahmed, requested Omar Sheikh to wire $100,000 to Mohammed Atta, who was the lead hijacker.
Hijacker Mohammed Atta received wire transfers via Pakistan. The man sending the money to Atta is believed to be Ahmed Umar Saeed Sheikh.
Omar Sheikh admitted he was supported by the Pakistan government's intelligence service, the ISI.
We know that the men who were supposedly the hijackers had their houses, cars, credit cards paid for by the U.S. government. They were, in truth, agents.
Number 10, top reason for thinking the hijackers are fake. Their names do not appear on any passenger manifest. That's not easy to arrange, my friends. If you know of any other case, I'd be interested in hearing it. Number 9, none of them were subject to any autopsy. Would have been interesting, powerful evidence if in fact we had some bodies here to offer some proof, but there is none. Number 8, top 10 reason for thinking these hijackers are fake. 5 to 7 at least have turned up alive and well and living in the Middle East. They've even been interviewed by the BBC and The Guardian in the UK. Now, I dare say that if they were actually killed in the impact of these airliners, then it's even more difficult to imagine how they could have arranged those interviews.
Walid al-Shari is a Saudi Airlines pilot in Casablanca, Morocco. Wael M. al-Shari is alive and well. Abdulaziz al-Amari is a Saudi Airlines pilot living in Saudi Arabia. Mohand al-Shari is alive in Saudi Arabia. Khalid al-Madar is a computer programmer in Mecca. Salam al-Hamzi works at a chemical plant in Yanbo, Saudi Arabia. Saeed al-Ghamdi is training to be a pilot in Tunis. Ahmed al-Nami is an administrative supervisor for Saudi Airlines. And last but not least, Mohammed Atta's father claimed to receive a phone call from his son on September 12th. 14 of the hijackers based their training in Florida, and the 5 that allegedly hijacked Flight 77 lived in a motel right outside the gates of the NSA.
But here's one of the biggest pieces of evidence. You all heard them say that a paper passport fell out of one of the towers and was picked up by a police officer on the street. This plane flies into the building, explodes with jet fuel out of the guy's jacket, goes through the fireball, through the side of the plane, out of the burning building, fire shooting out, and comes down to the ground unscathed. But something happened. For 6 months they reported they had this passport. Boy, we've got it, we've got the proof. And then the guy stood up and was alive in the Middle East, and they pulled it and said, oh, that was a mistake. He wasn't a hijacker, and the story just disappeared.
Reason number 7, the FBI nevertheless has not revised its list. This is quite surprising. They have to be aware. David Ray Griffin's second book on 9/11, the 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, makes this point as his #1 item. They have to know, yet they have not revised their list. As an aside, I expect we're going to see some backtracking and equivocating now, and they're going to be saying, well, maybe they aren't really sure about all the names on their list. But listen to this. Reason number 6. A special agent of the FBI by the name of Flagg, F-L-A-G-G, has explained that the FBI knew almost immediately the names of all 19 hijackers because they discovered a piece of luggage left by Mohammed Atta when he had driven up to Portland, Oregon, and then turned around and rushed down to Logan just in time to participate in the hijacking of a plane from that airport. According to Flagg, this piece of luggage Atta left behind included not only a terrorist manual, but a very convenient list of the 19 hijackers. And I say, well, that's really quite stunning, considering 5, 6, or 7 of these guys have turned up alive and well. How can you explain that? And that, incidentally, gives new meaning to the word false flag. My top 10, number 5 reason for thinking these hijackers were fake. They could not have flown the planes. Niels Agadavan, among others, who's a pilot and aeronautical engineer, has studied their training background, and it's simply preposterous to presume these guys who could barely get a Cessna off the ground could have piloted a commercial airliner and brought it to its target. It's preposterous. Top 10 reason number 4. Those cell phone calls that we've heard so much about could not have been made at the altitudes and speeds these planes were flying. A.K. Dubney, a professor of computer science from Western Ontario, has taken cell phones of different makes and models on different flights around the country and discovered at altitudes above 2,000 feet and speeds above 230 miles an hour that cell phone connections become fewer and farther between. They would have been impossible. And that, of course, would include the one you've all heard about from alleged passenger Mark Bingham, where he calls his mother and says, "Mom, this is Mark Bingham." You believe me, don't you? Top 10 reason number 3. During the trial of the alleged 20th hijacker, Zacarias Moussaoui, a tape recording was played allegedly from Flight 93, which included the passengers discussing how they were going to attempt to break down the cabin door using a drink cart. One astute student of the case wrote me to point out that this was ostensibly a cockpit voice recording, and that cockpit voice recorders do not record voices in the passenger compartment. Top 10 reason number 2 why these hijackers appear to be fake. The last words attributed on that tape to the hijackers who are facing imminent death was Allah Akbar, which is Arabic for God is great, God is great. According to a Muslim member of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, the last words that a devout follower of Islam should say when confronting imminent death is not those words, but rather, in Arabic, there is but one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. I therefore suggest that the writers assigned to this script simply didn't know enough to get it right. Number one, top 10 reason number one for believing these hijackers were fake. Zacarias Moussaoui, this April, was subjected to a trial to determine whether he should be punished for by life imprisonment or even death for not coming forward to reveal the plot, which the government maintained, had he done, would have enabled the government to have intervened and saved lives. I make 3 observations. A year before, Zacarias Moussaoui confessed to a different plot. He had acknowledged that he had been involved in a plot to fly a plane into the White House in order to extort release of a terrorist, a sheik who had been imprisoned for terrorist activities in 1993. He denied he had anything to do with 9/11. A year later, the federal government has played a shell game, and now they're insinuating and implying he had something to do with 9/11. As my good friend Webster Tarpley has observed, this man had no obligation to come forward and to confess his involvement in a plot, even if he had been involved in 9/11. We still have something here known as the Fifth Amendment. He had no obligation to incriminate himself. Third, and most tellingly, and this must have been incredibly embarrassing to the government, an FBI agent testified he'd been following Moussaoui. He'd been observing him taking this flight training. He had suspected that he might be involved in a terrorist plot, even to fly planes into the trade towers, though he suggested later that was merely a lucky guess. He testified under oath that he had told his superiors about his suspicions, not once, not twice, 70 times. And I say to you, 5 or 6 might be excused as ordinary incompetence. 20 or 25 may be criminal neglect. 70 times has to have been a matter of direct policy, deliberate policy. They were keeping these guys in reserve so they could use them as their cover story when the government itself perpetrated these dastardly terrorist acts.
So you can keep an eye on me?
Yes. When they analysed the stock market after 9/11, the CIA discovered a massive shorting of airline stocks. When the stocks hit bottom on 9/12, somebody made a fortune.
I gotta be honest with you. When the September 11 situation happened, I didn't know that. And I must say, and I want to say this because I want to take it lightly. It's not a light situation. It's a devastating act. It was really a bad thing. It was one of the worst things I've seen in my lifetime, you know. But I will tell you, and every trader will tell you, who was not in that building and who was buying gold and who owned gold and silver, that when it happened, the first thing you thought about was, well, how much is gold up? The first thing that came to mind was, my God, gold must be exploding. Fortunately for us, all our clients were in gold. So when it went up, they all doubled their money. Everybody doubled their money. It was a blessing in disguise. devastating, crushing, heart-shattering, but on a financial sense, for my clients that were in the market, they all made money. Now, I wasn't looking for this type of help. But it happened. When the U.S. bombed Iraq back in 1991, the price of oil went from $13 to $40 a barrel, for Christ's sake. Now, we couldn't wait for the bomb to start raining down on Saddam Hussein. We were all excited. We wanted Saddam to really create problems. Do whatever you have to do. Set fire to some more oil wells because the price is going to go higher. Every broker was chanting that. There was not a broker that I know of that wasn't excited about that. This was a disaster. This was something that was, catastrophe happening, bombing, wars. In devastation, there is opportunity. Opportunity, 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 opportunity.
A put option is a bet that a stock price is going to fall. If one were to put a single put option contract on American Airlines at $30 a share and the stock fell to $18, one could purchase 100 shares at $18 and immediately sell them for $30, netting a profit of $12 a share. This is exactly what happened on a far larger scale with many companies around the world on 9/11. The levels of options purchased the week of 9/11 were more than 6 times higher than normal. A former member of the German parliament, then responsible for oversight of the German Secret Service, estimated that profits by insider traders were $15 billion.
Wall Street analyst Phil Erlinger was the first to spot the suspicious trades.
What I see is prior knowledge. You can call it conspiracy. It's my opinion that somebody knew ahead of time that 9/11 was going to happen and they made bets to take advantage of it. And these bets weren't just normal run-of-the-day bets. They were far in excess of what we would call normal activity.
Put options set to expire on September 30th, 2001 were bought on August 6, 2001 or earlier at the Chicago Board Options Exchange.
These put options were basically a bet that the stock would plummet. When it did, the people who purchased those put options made a lot of money.
Thousands of put stock options were bought on United and American Airlines immediately prior to September 11th, 2001. On average, during the first weeks of September 2001, 27 put options were bought each day on Morgan Stanley, one of the World Trade Center's largest occupants. The total of its put options for the 3 days prior to the attacks was 2,157. Merrill Lynch, also in the WTC, saw 12,215 put stock options. That is 12 times its normal level. Between September 6th and 7th, Chicago Board Options Exchange saw 4,744 put option contracts with United Airlines and only 396 call options. On September 10th, put options for American Airlines totaled 4,516 versus 748 call options. In addition, these trades were not only occurring in our country, but around the world. There is no chance that all or even most of the trades were placed by Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. According to Fox News, CNN, and the BBC, insider trading reports were found in the USA, Germany, Britain, France, Canada, Japan, Monte Carlo, Switzerland, Hong Kong, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Singapore. The director of the CIA headed a firm that bought some of these put stock options. Until 1998, Buzzy Krongard headed United Airlines stock. Mr. Krongard was head of Bankers Trust until he resigned and was promoted to CIA Executive Director by President Bush in March 2001. Buzzy Krongard purchased this stock, and our government did nothing about it. Deutsche Bank is also one of the 4 banks most used by the bin Laden family. Additionally, $2.5 million in put options on United and American Airlines went unclaimed. The German central bank president, Ernst Weltec, had a study conducted by his bank. It indicated, quote, "There are ever clearer signs that there were activities on international financial markets that must have been carried out with the necessary expert knowledge in industries such as gold, oil, airlines, and insurance companies."
There was a lot of money to be made from the events of September 11th. And indeed, many people in our own government called the events of September 11th an opportunity, an opportunity.
The firm used to place the put options on United Airlines stock was managed until 1998 by the man who is now the number 3 executive director position at the CIA. A.B. Buzzy Krongard became vice chairman of Bankers Trust when the two firms merged, and his new position was to oversee private client relationships. Krongard had a special hands-on relationship with some of the wealthiest people in the world in a specialized banking operation that Senator Carl Levin identified as being connected to the laundering of drug money. Bankers Trust was acquired by Deutsche Bank in 1999 to form the single largest bank in Europe. Before 9/11, Kevin Ingram, an executor for Bankers Trust Deutsche Bank, pled guilty to laundering money to finance terrorist operations for groups linked to Osama bin Laden. Deutsche Bank has been a favorite of the bin Laden family and was connected to the hijackers and their support network. Deutsche Bank had corresponding relationships with banks in Bahrain and Kuwait that served George W. Bush when he engaged in illegal insider trading of shares of his company Harkin Energy. Both banks, Kuwait Finance House and Faisal Islamic Bank of Bahrain, had dealt with Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. But when the Bush administration released its worldwide list of suspect financial institutions vowing to track down terrorist financing, neither bank was on the list. Mayo Shattuck III is a powerful force in the financial world. Head of the Alex Brown Deutsche Bank on 9/11, he had previously been involved in Enron, helping them conceal their massive debt, as well as involved in an insider trading scam involving Adnan Khashoggi's Genesis Intermedia immediately before 9/11. He was midway through a 3-year, $30 million contract as head of Alex Brown when the attacks came, and under his management, some of the illegal trades on United Airlines were placed. Mayo Shattuck has taken over Alex Brown operations in 1997 after Krongard had officially gone to the CIA in 1998. Mayo Shattuck III resigned on the day after 9/11.
Something wasn't right that day.
On Broadway and Warren Street, because of the secondary explosion, we've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion.
Pfeiffer was the first chief into the building. Right away, a guy from the Port Authority told him the damage was somewhere above the 78th floor. But all you had to do was look around. It was obvious. Something had happened right there in the lobby.
You just saw that all the windows were blown out.
The lobby looked like the plane hit the lobby.
NBC's Pat Dawson is close to the scene of that attack. Pat?
Just moments ago, I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. He received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. There was another explosion which took place. According to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
Very strong. Boom! An explosion so hard that pushes upwards. upwards.
Rick Sanchez has been there throughout this morning for us. Rick, tell us where you are and what the latest is.
I spoke with some police officials moments ago, Chris, and they told me that they have reason to believe that one of the explosions at the World Trade Center may have been caused by a van that was parked in the building that may have had some type of explosive device in it.
Jack, what can you tell us happened first in New York?
Apparently what appears to happen was that at the same time two planes hit the building, that the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now that's the first time we're hearing that. So two planes and explosives that were in the building, is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is still unconfirmed, but that is what the FBI is going on at this point.
We had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that.
We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted, whether in fact there wasn't something else at the base of the towers that in fact were the coup de grace to bring them to the ground.
We ran down the steps to the lobby. There was no lobby. Everything was torn up.
So we continued down the stairs. We came outside in the lobby. There was no lobby. The lobby was totally gone.
Did you see other people?
People, there's a woman there with her face blown off.
It looks like a ghost town. There are federal agents with guns standing outside the federal buildings, clearing people out. The only thing left in the street are people's shoes as they ran out of their shoes to escape the fire bombs and the explosions.
I saw the plane coming this way in a spot. It goes factory directly to the building.
Was this the first plane or the second plane?
That was the first plane. The second plane, there's no second plane. It was a bomb. Bombed in the building, not second plane. That was a bomb.
Like, it sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, three big explosions.
It was boom, boom, and the floor started shaking. And then we saw debris fall down, and next thing we know, we had to get out of the building. We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
It just went ba-boom. It was like a bomb went off. And it was like holy hell coming down them stairs. And then when we finally got to the bottom, they were coming out on the mezzanine level there, and another explosion came right from it because everything went flying.
What did we do? We made it outside. We made it about a block.
We made it at least two blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down. I was watching it and running. Just ran.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
A truckload of explosives was discovered around the George Washington Bridge. That bridge links New York to New Jersey over the Hudson River. Whether the discovery of those explosives has anything to do with other events of the day is unclear, but the FBI has two suspects in hand, said that enough explosives were in the truck to do great damage to the George Washington Bridge.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
You gotta get back from here.
I know that.
You gotta get back.
All right? Don't worry about me. You need to make calls right now. All right.
Bomb in the building, start clearing out. Sorry, you said there's a bomb? What'd you say? A bomb in the building, start clearing out. Got it.
Started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. This building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up.
Just in the last few seconds, another building, building number 7, one of the buildings in support of the World Trade Center towers, has collapsed. This is no small building, as you can see, at 47 stories. It would stand out in most American cities.
The Red Cross rep was like, he goes over and he says, well, you got to stay behind this line because they're thinking about bringing the building down. They didn't say what building, they just said bringing a building down. So we're like, okay, you know, we'll take their word for it, you know, we'll stay behind the line. And he went over and he talked to one of the, through all the commotion, he goes over and he asked one of the Red Cross, or one of the firefighters, what was going on. I guess, I don't know if he got an answer or not. He came back over with his hand over the radio, and it sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
We got down to the 3rd floor, and that's where the stairwell collapsed on us. And we had to dig our way out. Now the building's coming down. We can't see nothing. Once again, I'm saying our prayers. You know, the show is over here now. This is it. And with that, all of a sudden, we're looking for another stairwell. Me and the lieutenant open the door. We find a body in this closet. We were like, what the heck is that? Where did this come from? Holy shit, what's going on here? Something's crazy going on. We got our way out of the 3rd floor, and that's where the maintenance fella with a little flashlight saved our lives. He was pointed over, and if it wasn't for him, we never would have found another stairwell. The building would have collapsed. So
Willie Rodriguez?
Willie Rodriguez. Thank you, Willie. He saved our lives. Saved about 12 guys' lives that day. At least. We got down to the lobby, and everything was blown out, exploded. Everything was. And we were the only ones in the lobby now. We're going, wait a second here. Where is everybody? We was just, you know, you think about it, you say something else had to go on here. Something else was going on here. This just don't happen like this if when a plane hits the 80th floor of a building and the lobby gets blown out. Sorry. I don't care. I don't care who you are. We're like, how is this happening when the plane was up 50 more stories and the stairwells collapsing on us? Something wasn't right, man. Something wasn't right in Denmark that day. For every window in the lobby to be exploded. I mean, them windows were like as thick as forget it. They were 2-3 inch glasses. You know, come on. They exploded out of the lobby. You know, something. It wasn't from the jet fuel. No way. The elevators exploded. They were down from the lobby. The lobby was over here. That should never have happened. Something would happen there, and that wasn't. We came down. It looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. There was no fire. It just looked like a bomb went off, and the building collapsed. The time and the things that went on between the plane and by the time the buildings came down, there was a lot of things that happened. It makes you really wonder what went on here. And that's you know, it's too much. It's too much. It's too much. There's too many things that went wrong that I mean, I don't like, you know, I'm not, I guess, an expert on a plane in the building, but just me being in there and experiencing what I've seen and dealt with, something wasn't right that day. And I think everybody in that lobby knew it. As you look at their faces and you could see fear, death, destruction happening in seconds.
It's gone, man.
What is a false flag? The encyclopedia definition reads, false flag operations are covert operations conducted by governments, corporations, or by other organizations which are designed to appear as if they were carried out by other entities. The name is derived from the military concept of flying false colors, that is, flying the flag of a country other than your own. There are many variants of false flag operations, but one of the most popular carried out by governments is to stage a terror attack or horrible criminal incident and then blame it on your political enemies. In the early 1960s, The federal government needed an excuse, a pretext to invade Cuba. Seldom do we see examples as sterling as the Northwoods document, where the federal government actually put the plan to paper. It was actually carried in published media reports in ABC News and, of course, the Baltimore Sun. The federal government proposed blowing up airliners full of Americans, saying that casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of indignation. The mad general, the architect of this plan, was General L.L. Lemonster, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. He got approval for his Faustian plan all the way up to the Secretary of Defense. President Kennedy was not amused. In the plan, they elaborated on how they could bomb Washington, D.C. and blame it on Cuba. Attack Marines at Guantanamo Bay using U.S. Army soldiers dressed up as Cubans. Or, they said, just like the sinking of the Maine to get into the Spanish-American War, we could blow up a ship again. Here they are admitting the problem reaction solution system and how effective it is to motivate the American people to get them behind a war, a nuclear war with Cuba and the Soviet Union. And you didn't believe that the government was capable of hijacking its own aircraft and killing its own citizens.
If you need a painted picture of what is happening in this country, let's recognize how history repeats itself. In February 1933, Hitler staged a false flag attack, burning down his own German parliament building, the Reichstag, and blamed it on communist terrorists. In the next few weeks, he passed the Enabling Act, which completely eradicated the German Constitution, destroying people's liberties. He then led a series of preemptive wars, all justified to the German people as necessary to maintaining homeland security.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
September 11th was the jumpstart for what is now an accelerated agenda by the ruthless elite. It was a staged war pretext no different than the sinking of the Lusitania, the provoking of Pearl Harbor, and the Gulf of Tonkin lie. In fact, if 9/11 wasn't a planned war pretext, it would be an exception to the rule. It has been used to launch 2 unprovoked illegal wars, one against Iraq and one against Afghanistan. However, 9/11 was a pretext for another war as well, the war against you. The Patriot Act, Homeland Security, the Military Tribunals Act, and other legislations are all completely and entirely designed to destroy your civil liberties and limit your ability to fight back against what is coming.
In his recent State of the Union address, George W. Bush referred to the 3 great evils of the last century: Hitlerism, communism, and militarism. He couldn't bring himself to say the word fascism because he is one, and he knows that he is one.
The arrogance of this Bush and Hitler is one of the closest comparisons I can possibly make. I was born in Germany. I went through the Nazi period until 14 days before the war broke out, and there are things going on in this country which make me feel just as uncomfortable as I did then.
There's a great similarity there. Plus, I think everything that Hitler did was legal in his country, and I think that Bush is really tearing the Constitution apart.
The American people never go to war unless they're tricked. They never gone to war unless they're tricked.
These elitists don't run the country based on what we think. They run it on what they want, and then they build up the propaganda. And what they now have schools on this called perception management and information warfare to make sure that they get some sort of public acceptance of it.
You know, the American people didn't want to go into Iraq, and they were finally conditioned to go in, but now 71% want us to come home after all the tragedy. Nobody wants to go into Iran, but you know, if there's some type of an incident that they can use to scare the people, frighten the people again, they may well come, you know, around to supporting it. But it's going to be even more tragic if we do this than going into Iraq, because I think the consequences are far more.
The notion of a U.S. war on terrorism is simply a fraud. There is no war on terrorism. The Anglo-Americans are backing terrorists exactly when and where it suits them.
The bulk of my research in my book, The War and Truth, concerns the role of Al-Qaeda as an instrument of Western covert operations. And this really does, for me, fundamentally undermine the entire concept, the war on terror, the entire view that they've given us of 9/11 and what happened. Because if Al-Qaeda is an instrument of covert operations rather than an enemy of the West, then there is no war on terror. And this is really the crux of the issue.
This is a typical British strategy. You've got to know the name of Brigadier General Sir Frank Kitson. He was the British operations officer in Kenya at the time of the Mau Mau. And what Kitson saw, which has been known to commanders for centuries, millennia, if you've got an underground nationalist organization and you want to discredit them, you create your own parallel underground nationalist organization. It's got to have the same name. It's got to have a false flag. You send them out, have it commit tremendous atrocities. Those will be blamed on the original relatively benign group, and they'll be discredited, they'll be demonized, and you gain political advantage. He wrote a book about it called Low Intensity Operations. And the technique is called the technique of the counter gang or the pseudo gang. Just as Al-Qaeda, in the broader sense, is a pseudo gang or counter gang created by US and British and Israeli intelligence. It's a counter gang against normal Arab nationalists or anybody with any positive agenda for reform or independence or development anywhere in the Arab world. They can always be labeled Al-Qaeda. The reductio ad absurdum of this is President Chavez of Venezuela, after giving Bush a hard time at various conferences and doing things to undermine the dollar, the neocons are now accusing President Chavez of being a member of Al-Qaeda. So you can see how easy it is to demonize somebody once you've got a good counter gang going.
It's now been documented beyond a doubt, based on historical records, that the CIA, the MI6, teamed up with very, very secretive parallel elements of European intelligence services and orchestrated terrorist attacks to mobilize the public against the left, against the communists, and so on and so forth. And this would be really shocking to people if they knew that this is what happened. And this is what happened, there's no doubt about it. I mean, the best book on it is Daniel Ganser's book, NATO's Secret Armies. So this is serious academic stuff.
Conspiracies don't need 10,000 people. They just need a few people to be carried out. But what they need also is hundreds of millions of people out there who don't want to assume the risk and the responsibility for getting to the root causes.
It is not shameful to ask questions. What if we had asked questions back? I'm sure all of you are aware of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. You know that the past is prologue here, that we have a false flag, an excuse to go to war. It happened in Pearl Harbor. It happened with the Operation Northwoods. Just Google it and read to your heart's content, where the United States government has been behind so many of these different things and blamed it on someone else. This is our Reichstag fire. This is what will implement, will bring us into martial law. This has functioned to take away our civil liberties. It could not have happened. We could not have had the excuse to go to war to get us there. This has been planned for a long time, long before 9/11. How is it that the very next day, all of a sudden, well, it's Osama bin Laden? Whenever they tell you they know who it is, you know, I mean, right away we knew who did it. We had the passports of these guys in the rubble of the World Trade Center. Vesey Street, where they found those passports, I used to walk up and down that street all the time. And when I saw the rubble in that street up to here, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, these buildings were pulverized, fuselages were destroyed, but a passport was intact. Right then and there, I knew it was a lie. Just like Oklahoma City, where they found these journals. They always find something that right away that proves, you know, we're going here and we're from this group and we hate these people and okay, look this is who did it. And every time you see that, you know that that's a big lie.
War is always a lie, and it's always begun by a set of lies. Truth is the first casualty of war, said Aeschylus the Greek thousands of years ago. And usually the lie is a staged incident that gives the excuse for going to war. And these kind of stage incidents, which frighten people, become a way to get social hegemony and social control.
Now